The 1970s. British entertainment industry had a peculiar habit. It took some of its most talented performers and convinced the entire nation they were idiots. From Radio 1's Breakfast King to the man behind Darth Vader's mask, these 10 celebrities became punchlines, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they were so brilliant at playing fools that Britain forgot it was all an act. What you're about to discover might change how you view an entire decade of British entertainment history. Tony Blackburn, the DJ who wore his heart on the airwaves. When Radio 1 launched its first broadcast, Tony Blackburn's voice was the inaugural sound heard across Britain. As the undisputed king of the breakfast show throughout the 1970s, Blackburn woke up millions of Britons each morning with trademark energy that became both his signature and his curse. His listening figures reached astronomical heights, yet public perception of his intellect remained considerably lower. To the cynical British press and the growing counterculture movement, Blackburn embodied what they saw as the vacuous DJ, a man who appeared to possess a brain made entirely of candy floss and sunshine. He became the primary target for satire, often portrayed as someone who could talk for hours without actually saying anything of substance, filling the airwaves with what critics called inane chatter, terrible jokes, and a level of cheesy optimism completely out of step with the grim economic reality of the decade. The ridicule Blackburn faced extended beyond his job description. In the early 1970s, he released a series of albums that were met with hysterical laughter rather than critical acclaim. His singing voice was frequently described as thin and reedy, yet he promoted these records with what observers called a painful lack of self-awareness. He appeared on television variety shows, flashing his teeth and wearing shirts unbuttoned to the navel, crooning love songs while audiences visibly cringed. He became the poster boy for the medallion man stereotype, a figure of fun who seemed convinced of his own sex appeal while the rest of the nation saw a man trying far too hard. The music press, particularly the sharper writers at the NME, tore him to shreds, treating him as a symbol of everything manufactured and plastic about the entertainment industry. However, the moment that truly cemented his reputation as a figure of ridicule occurred in 1976 during the breakdown of his marriage to actress Tessa Wyatt. In a display of what was termed emotional naivety that left the nation stunned, Tony decided to air his personal struggles to his millions of listeners. Instead of maintaining a dignified silence, he used his morning show as a personal therapy session, playing the tearjerker ballad "If You Leave Me Now" by Chicago repeatedly. He would weep between songs, begging his wife to return to him, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was turning a private tragedy into a public spectacle. The British public, known for their stiff upper lip approach to personal matters, were horrified and amused in equal measure. It was seen as the ultimate act of a man who could not distinguish between reality and show business, someone who thought that real life could be resolved with a dedication on the radio. This lack of judgment extended to his on-air gimmicks, most notably a fictitious dog named Arnold. Tony would spend large portions of his show having conversations with a barking sound effect, a gimmick that might have amused toddlers, but served only to convince adults that the man behind the microphone had lost the plot. He became the inspiration for the Smashy and Nicey sketches years later, a caricature of the DJ who loves the sound of his own voice but appears to have nothing going on upstairs. Even when the punk rock explosion happened in 1977, threatening to sweep away what the youth saw as dinosaurs of the industry, Tony remained seemingly oblivious, dismissing the movement with a wave of his hand, further proving to young Britain that he was hopelessly out of touch. Despite the relentless mockery, Tony Blackburn survived the decade, but he did so as a national punchline. He was the man everyone laughed at, the celebrity who seemed to live in a bubble of his own making, protected from the sharp edges of the world by what critics perceived as his own lack of depth. He was the star who had looks and charm, but in the eyes of his critics, absolutely zero substance. His legacy in the 1970s is that of a man who smiled through the ridicule, perhaps never quite realizing that the joke was firmly on him. And he was the ultimate lightweight in a decade of heavy metal and heavy politics. A man whose epitaph for the era could simply be, he played the records, but he didn't understand the music. Sid Vicious, the punk icon who couldn't play. If Tony Blackburn was the lightweight fool of the pop world, Sid Vicious was the terrifying jester of the punk rock revolution, a man whose entire career was built on the open secret that he possessed absolutely zero musical talent. Born John Simon Ritchie, he was rebranded by the cunning manager Malcolm McLaren as the ultimate symbol of rebellion. Yet to the music press and serious musicians of the 1970s, Sid was little more than what insiders called a useful idiot. He was recruited into the Sex Pistols in 1977, not because he could play the bass guitar, he famously could not play a single note at the time, but because he looked the part. With his spiked hair, sneering lip, and chaotic wardrobe, he was the perfect visual prop for a band that thrived on outrage. The joke amongst industry insiders was that Sid was a coat hanger with an attitude, a young man who had stumbled into the biggest cultural movement of the decade simply by being in the right place and having the right lack of inhibition. The extent of his musical incompetence was the subject of much hilarity and derision during the band's short and explosive existence. It is a well-documented fact that during live performances, his amplifier was frequently turned off by the sound engineers or the other band members. They knew that if the audience actually heard what Sid was playing, that the wall of noise would collapse into a discordant mess. He would thrash around the stage, striking poses and glaring at the crowd, blissfully unaware, or perhaps not caring, that his contribution to the sound was non-existent. Lemmy Kilmister, the legendary frontman of Motorhead, once attempted to teach Sid how to play the bass before he joined the Pistols. After a few frustrating sessions, Lemmy reportedly gave up, telling Sid that it was hopeless and that he could not teach someone who had no rhythm, no ear, and seemingly no interest in learning the craft. To the serious rock musicians of the 1970s, Sid was an insult to the profession, what they considered a village idiot who had been given a microphone. His lack of intellect was frequently highlighted by his erratic and self-destructive behavior, which the tabloids devoured with glee. Sid did not understand the line between performance art and reality. While his bandmate Johnny Rotten was articulate, sharp-witted, and cynical, Sid was often portrayed as a confused child wandering through a dangerous adult world. He would carve words into his own chest with a razor blade during interviews or smash glasses over his head to provoke a reaction. Actions that were seen not as artistic statements, but as the flailing of a man who did not have the vocabulary to express himself any other way. The British press painted him as a mindless thug, a caricature of the punk who existed only to shock the older generation. He wore a T-shirt displaying a swastika, not because he understood or supported the ideology, but because he knew it would make people angry, a shallow and foolish gesture that earned him widespread contempt. The ridicule intensified during the band's disastrous tour of the United States in 1978. By this point, the Sex Pistols were disintegrating, and Sid had become the main attraction of the circus. In Texas, he famously got into a physical altercation with an audience member at a cowboy bar, swinging his bass guitar like a medieval weapon. The American media treated him like a zoo animal, a spectacle of British stupidity to be gawked at. His defining moment of the decade, and perhaps the ultimate proof of his role as the clown prince of punk, was his solo cover of the Frank Sinatra classic, My Way. In the video, he stumbles down a staircase, mumbling the lyrics before pulling out a handgun and shooting the audience. It was intended to be a satirical take on the entertainment industry, but many viewed it as a sad documentary of a man who had no talents other than destruction. Ultimately, the story of Sid Vicious in the 1970s is a tragedy of a young man who was exploited for his image and mocked for his limitations. He was surrounded by people who were smarter and more calculating than he was, people who saw his lack of intelligence as a marketing tool. He was the poster boy for what critics saw as the vacuous side of punk, the proof that in the 70s you did not need to be clever or talented to be a star. You just needed to be willing to make a spectacle of yourself. While the world laughed at his antics and his inability to play his instrument, Sid was spiraling into a dark world of substance reliance that would eventually claim him. And he remains the definitive example of the know-nothing celebrity, a star who burned brightly, not because of what he could do, but because of what he represented to a society that was fascinated by the spectacle of total incompetence. Paul Henry, the actor trapped by Benny. If there was one face in the 1970s that became the universal shorthand for a lack of intelligence, it was the bewildered expression of Paul Henry, or as the entire nation knew him, Benny from Crossroads. While Paul was a classically trained actor from the Birmingham School of Speech and Drama, his portrayal of the simple-minded handyman, Benny Hawkins, was so convincing that it effectively destroyed his identity as an intelligent man in the eyes of the British public. For over a decade, he was the figurehead of the soap opera Crossroads, made a program that was itself relentlessly mocked for its wobbly sets and low-budget production values. However, the ridicule directed at Paul went far beyond critical disdain for the show. It became a cruel cultural phenomenon that turned a talented performer into a national punchline. The character of Benny was designed to be a lovable, gentle soul, usually found wearing his trademark woolly hat and referring to his female boss as Miss Diane. Yet in the school playgrounds and workplaces of 1970s, Britain, the name Benny morphed into a derogatory slur. To call someone a Benny was to call them stupid, slow, or socially awkward. Paul Henry found himself at the center of this storm, unable to walk down the street without people shouting catchphrases at him, or worse, and treating him as if he genuinely possessed the limited cognitive abilities of his character. He later recounted instances where members of the public would speak to him in slow, loud voices, assuming that the man on the screen and the man in reality were one and the same. It was a bizarre and humiliating existence where his professional success as an actor was measured by how successfully he had convinced the world he was an idiot. The mockery was compounded by the press, who often treated Crossroads as a television disaster that people watched purely for the laughs. Paul was frequently photographed in character wearing the oversized, ill-fitting beanie hat that became his prison. The tabloids would run stories questioning why the show was so popular despite its terrible quality, with Benny's simple storylines often cited as evidence of the viewing public's decline in taste. While other actors in the 1970s were being lauded for their intellect in dramas like I, Claudius, Paul was famous for scenes where he struggled to understand the basic mechanics of a conversation. He was the court jester of the soap world, a role that paid the bills but came with a heavy tax on his dignity. Behind the scenes, the cast of Crossroads worked under a grueling schedule, churning out episodes with barely any rehearsal time, which often led to the fluffed lines and awkward pauses that the public found so hilarious. Paul, however, took his craft seriously, basing Benny's mannerisms on a local man he knew, trying to bring a sense of pathos to the role. It is a testament to the cruelty of the era that this nuance was largely ignored in favor of pointing and laughing at the village idiot. The distinction between the actor and the role had completely collapsed. He was not seen as Paul Henry, the man who had worked with the Royal Shakespeare Company. He was just Benny, the man in the hat who didn't know his left from his right. This public perception had a devastating effect on his career prospects outside of the soap. Casting directors in the 1970s and beyond could not see past the woolly hat. He was typecast as the fool, the gormless sidekick, or the victim. The industry, much like the audience, refused to believe that there was a brain ticking away beneath the beanie. Even when he tried to launch a pop career in 1977 with a song based on his character, it was treated as a novelty joke, reinforcing the idea that he was merely a figure of fun. Paul Henry's experience in the 70s serves as a stark reminder of how a character can cannibalize a star. He gave the nation one of its most iconic figures, but in return, the nation turned his name into an insult for stupidity, a legacy that was both a triumph of acting and a tragedy of perception. Andrew Sachs, the waiter who took the beating. If there was a single word that defined British comedy in the 1970s, it was the confused, high-pitched query. "K?" This one syllable turned Andrew Sachs into a household name, but it also imprisoned him in the persona of Manuel, the well-meaning but hopelessly incompetent Spanish waiter from Fawlty Towers. To the millions of viewers who tuned into the BBC, Manuel was the ultimate figure of fun, a man so lacking in basic intelligence that he could not understand the simplest instruction without causing a catastrophe. The laughter he generated was immense, but it was laughter directed entirely at his stupidity and his victimization. Every week, the nation howled as he was verbally abused, physically assaulted, and treated like a naughty child by the towering figure of Basil Fawlty. For Andrew, a serious actor who had fled Nazi Germany as a child and built a respectable career in radio drama, becoming the face of national idiocy was a strange and often painful paradox. The public perception of Andrew Sachs in the 1970s was inextricably linked to the physical humiliation he endured on screen. He was not just playing a fool, he was the whipping boy for the frustrations of the decade. And the physical comedy required him to be hit with frying pans, poked in the eye, and whacked with a spoon, all while maintaining a look of vacuous confusion. The audience often forgot that this was a highly skilled performance requiring impeccable timing. Instead, they saw a dumb foreigner who deserved the clip round the ear. The blurring of lines between the man and the character was so severe that people would approach him in the street and speak to him in broken English, shouting slowly and loudly as if he genuinely possessed the limited cognitive faculties of a waiter from Barcelona. He was treated not as a master of farce, but as a lovable imbecile, a mascot for anyone who had ever misunderstood a simple order. The demand for Manuel's stupidity was so high that it spilled over into the music charts, made a common graveyard for the dignity of 1970s television stars. In 1979, Andrew released a novelty single titled Manuel's Good Food Guide. Ideally, this should have been a satire, but the public consumed it as another opportunity to laugh at the man who knew nothing. He appeared on top of the pops in character, stumbling around the stage and cementing the idea that he was a one-note joke. While his bank balance benefited from the mania, his artistic soul struggled with the fact that his extensive knowledge of playwrights and his subtle vocal work were being ignored in favor of a mustache and a funny accent. He had become a prisoner of a role that required him to suppress his intelligence completely to survive. Behind the laughter, the production of Fawlty Towers was fraught with genuine danger that highlighted how disposable the stupid character was deemed to be. In the famous episode, The Germans, a scene involving a fire went horribly wrong. Andrew was left with second-degree acid burns on his arms and back due to a special effects mix-up. Yet he continued to film, suffering in silence to get the shot. On another occasion, he was knocked unconscious by a heavy prop. The industry and the audience seemed to view his pain as part of the package. He was the clown whose job was to fall down and get hurt for their amusement. The cruelty of the slapstick was accepted because in the eyes of the viewer, Manuel didn't know any better. By the end of the decade, Andrew Sachs was one of the most famous men in Britain, but he was trapped in a gilded cage of ignorance. He spent the rest of his career trying to prove that he could play villains, intellectuals, and serious dramatic roles. But the shadow of the bumbling waiter was long. Casting directors in the late 70s struggled to see him as anything other than the man who put the butter on the Waldorf salad. His story is a testament to the power of a great performance to destroy an actor's identity. He played the fool so perfectly that the world refused to believe he was anything else, laughing at his zero brains while he quietly went home to read literature, nursing the bruises he earned, making them smile. Michael Crawford, the man behind Frank Spencer's wine. To the British public of the 1970s, Michael Crawford was not a man. He was a walking disaster area wrapped in a trench coat and a beret. As Frank Spencer, the calamitous protagonist of the sitcom Some Mothers Do Have 'Em, Crawford created the definitive portrait of the helpless man-child, a character so spectacularly incompetent that he became the nation's favorite idiot. From the moment the show premiered in 1973, Crawford's identity was entirely consumed by the persona of Frank. The audience did not see the classically trained actor or the fearless stuntman who performed his own dangerous gags. They saw a gormless fool who spoke in a high-pitched whine and could not walk across a room without destroying the furniture. He was the ultimate figure of fun, mocked in playgrounds, offices, and pubs across the country by people mimicking his catchphrase, "Ooh, Betty," usually accompanied by a disparaging comment about his lack of brain cells. The genius of Crawford's performance was also his curse. He played the role of the zero-brains incompetent with such convincing dedication that the line between fiction and reality blurred to a dangerous degree. In the eyes of the 1970s viewer, Frank Spencer was a documentary subject, a man so utterly ill-equipped for adult life that he evoked a mixture of pity and hysterical laughter. The public reveled in his stupidity, cheering as he failed driving tests, demolished kitchens, and found himself dangling from the bumpers of moving cars. They treated him as the village idiot of the national airwaves, a mascot for anyone who had ever made a mistake. Yet the laughter was often tinged with a cruel sense of superiority. To be called a Frank Spencer in the 1970s was shorthand for being useless, a clumsy fool who should not be trusted with anything sharper than a spoon. While the nation laughed at his apparent lack of intelligence, they were largely ignorant of the immense physical and mental discipline required to be that stupid. Crawford was risking his life for their amusement, performing stunts that terrified professional stuntmen. In one famous 1970s episode, he roller-skated underneath a moving, articulated lorry, a feat that required split-second timing and nerves of steel. Yet, because the character was a blithering idiot, the audience assumed the actor was merely stumbling through luck. They did not credit him with bravery or skill. They simply saw a fool falling over. The press fed into this narrative. It's often portraying Crawford in interviews as a man who shared his character's chaotic energy, refusing to let him be serious or intellectual. He was trapped in the beret, forced to play the clown even when the cameras stopped rolling, because that was the only version of him the public was willing to accept. The typecasting was brutal and unrelenting. For the rest of the decade, Crawford found it nearly impossible to secure serious dramatic work in Britain. Casting directors could not look at him without waiting for him to trip over the carpet or say something incredibly dim-witted. He was a prisoner of his own success, a man who had played the role of the imbecile so perfectly that the industry believed he was one. The psychological toll of being the nation's punching bag was significant. Crawford was a perfectionist. To a man of deep artistic ambition who wanted to be respected for his voice and his acting range, not just for his ability to fall off a roof in a funny way. He had become a caricature, a two-dimensional figure of fun whose intelligence was constantly underestimated by a public that preferred the comfortable fiction of the idiot Frank. It would take decades for Crawford to shake off the ghost of the 1970s and reinvent himself as the Phantom of the Opera, finally proving to the world that he possessed a voice and a presence of immense power. However, during the decade of the 70s, he was the property of the mob, a man whose name was synonymous with incompetence. His story is a striking example of how the British public in that era loved to laugh at the dim celebrity. and often failing to recognize that it takes a genius to play a fool so effectively. Michael Crawford gave the world laughter, but in return, the world stripped him of his dignity, treating him like a naughty child who had lost his way rather than one of the most physically gifted physical comedians in the history of television. Robin Askwith, the Confession King. If the British film industry of the 1970s had a face that represented pure, unadulterated foolishness, it was the cheeky, gurning expression of Robin Askwith. As the star of the phenomenally successful Confessions series, beginning with Confessions of a Window Cleaner in 1974, Askwith became the poster boy for a genre of cinema that critics labeled as brainless. To the high-minded reviewers of the broadsheet newspapers, Askwith was the ultimate symbol of the decline of British culture, a man whose entire career seemed to consist of falling off ladders, dropping his trousers, and getting into scrapes that a 5-year-old would have the sense to avoid. He was not viewed as an actor, but as a giggling idiot who had stumbled onto a film set and been given a contract by mistake. The character he played, Timmy Lee, was designed to be a lovable simpleton, a young man driven entirely by his hormones and lacking even a shred of common sense. However, the public mania surrounding the films was so intense that the line between Robin Askwith and Timmy Lee evaporated almost instantly. In the eyes of the 1970s audience, Askwith was the bumbling window cleaner. He was treated in the street not as a movie star to be respected, but as a lad to be laughed at. Passers-by would shout crude catchphrases at him or ask him if he had fallen off any ladders lately, assuming that his intelligence in real life mirrored the vacant, happy-go-lucky nature of his on-screen persona. He was the court jester of the sexual revolution, a man whose primary function was to look confused and let things happen to him rather than a protagonist who drove the plot. The ridicule he faced from the establishment was withering. While he was keeping the British film industry afloat single-handedly, the Confessions films were often the only profitable movies being made in the mid-70s. He was treated with absolute contempt by his peers. Serious actors viewed him as a joke, a lowbrow clown who was cheapening the profession. He was frequently the butt of jokes on television chat shows, where hosts would interview him with a sneering condescension, marveling at how such rubbish could be so popular. They treated him like a lucky lottery winner rather than a performer, ignoring the fact that carrying a comedy film requires a specific and difficult skill set. To them, he was just the idiot in the tight shirt who made the working classes laugh, and therefore he was not to be taken seriously. Behind the scenes, the reality was that Robin Askwith was a shrewd and classically trained actor who had previously appeared in the prestigious avant-garde film If, alongside Malcolm McDowell. He was an articulate and intelligent man who found himself trapped in a golden cage of stupidity. He knew the scripts were ridiculous, he knew the dialogue was cringe-inducing, but he also knew they were paying the bills in an era where the rest of the industry was collapsing. He played the fool because the market demanded a fool. He leaned into the criticism, adopting a persona of breezy indifference, but privately, he was frustrated by the fact that casting directors for serious dramas would not touch him. They could not see past the Confessions label. To them, he had zero gravitas, zero depth, and by extension, zero brains. By the time the series ran out of steam in the late 1970s, Robin Askwith was a wealthy man, but his professional reputation was in tatters. He had been typecast so effectively as the naive fool that he was effectively unhireable for anything else. The decade that made him a star also turned him into a national punchline, a relic of a time when British cinema was obsessed with sauce and slapstick. He spent years trying to escape the shadow of Timmy Lee, but for the generation that grew up in the 70s, he would always remain the grinning fool on the poster, the man who represented a cinema of zero brains that everyone publicly mocked but secretly paid to see. His legacy is that of a man who sacrificed his artistic credibility to make a nation laugh only to find that they were laughing at him, not with him. Barbara Windsor, the blonde, behind the giggle, in the pantheon of British stars who were relentlessly typecast as lacking in gray matter, no one bore the burden of the dumb blonde stereotype quite like Barbara Windsor. To the cinema-going public of the 1970s, she was simply Babs, the bubbling, a giggling bundle of energy whose primary function in the Carry On films was to lose her bikini top and look confused. With her platinum blonde beehive, exaggerated eyelashes, and a laugh that sounded like a malfunctioning squeaky toy, she became the national mascot for the saucy but dim female archetype. The critics of the decade treated her with a patronizing sneer, dismissing her as a lightweight piece of fluff who had lucked into a career because of her vital statistics rather than her acting ability. To the highbrow commentators, she was the personification of everything that was tacky and unintellectual about British culture, a living cartoon character who existed solely to be the butt of lewd jokes. The tragedy of this perception was that it completely erased her background as a serious Tony Award-nominated actress who had been trained by the legendary Joan Littlewood. However, in the 1970s, the industry refused to see the talent. They only saw the caricature. Barbara found herself trapped in a cycle of roles that required her to play the naive, wide-eyed innocent who was blissfully unaware of the sexual innuendos flying around her head. The scripts invariably painted her as a woman with a heart of gold, but a head full of air, a dolly bird who needed a man to explain the world to her. The public loved her, but they laughed at her, not with her. They viewed her as a child in a woman's body, a perception that was reinforced by her diminutive height and her babyish voice. She was the nation's little sister, but a sister who was constantly mocked for being a bit thick. Her personal life in the 1970s only served to fuel the fire of public ridicule. Her high-profile marriage to Ronnie Knight, a man with deep connections to the London underworld, was treated by the press as evidence of her poor judgment and naivety. The tabloids painted a picture of a woman who was easily led, a gangster's moll who was too stupid to realize the dangerous waters she was swimming in. When her husband was involved in legal scandals, the public narrative was not one of sympathy for Barbara, but of derision. She was portrayed as the clueless wife standing by her man because she didn't know any better, a real-life extension of the gullible characters she played on screen. The media relished the contrast between her chirpy, innocent public image and the gritty reality of her private life, using it to suggest that she was living in a fantasy world. Professionally, the 1970s were a golden cage. While she was one of the most recognizable faces in the country, she was effectively barred from serious acting. Directors and producers assumed that audiences would simply burst into laughter the moment she appeared on stage in a dramatic role. She was told repeatedly that she wasn't cut out for heavy dialogue or complex emotion. She was hired to jiggle and giggle, and any attempt to break out of that mold was met with resistance. Even when she appeared in variety shows or interviews, hosts would speak to her in a condescending tone, as if she were a pet poodle that had learned to walk on its hind legs. They would ask her inane questions about fashion and makeup, ignoring her sharp wit and her deep knowledge of the entertainment business. She played the game because she had to survive, smiling through the insults and reinforcing the very image that was suffocating her. By the end of the decade, the Carry On franchise was collapsing, and Barbara was left stranded by the receding tide. The industry that had exploited her dumb persona now discarded her as a relic of a bygone era. She was viewed as a joke that had been told too many times, a symbol of 1970s excess that the new, cooler decade wanted to forget. For years, she struggled to be taken seriously, fighting against a reputation that suggested she had no brain. It would take decades for her to be rediscovered and respected as the matriarch of EastEnders. But in the 1970s, Barbara Windsor was the prisoner of her own giggle, a woman who was forced to hide her intelligence behind a mask of vacuous charm just to keep her name in lights. She was the smartest person in the room, playing the stupidest person on the screen, and the world was too busy laughing at her to notice the difference. David Prowse. The voice they couldn't use. If there was a man in the 1970s whose physical might was in total contradiction to the lack of respect shown to him by the industry, it was undoubtedly David Prowse. To millions of viewers around the globe, he was the terrifying silhouette of Darth Vader, the embodiment of cosmic evil in Star Wars. However, behind the scenes and in the British press, Prowse was treated not as a Dark Lord, but as a village idiot in a superhero costume. His personal tragedy lay in the fact that while he possessed the body of a Greek god, he spoke with a strong West Country accent, which in British culture of the time was unfairly associated with simple, uneducated country folk. On the film set, instead of inspiring fear, he inspired amusement. The film crew mockingly nicknamed him Darth Farmer, suggesting that this powerful man should be shoveling hay in a field rather than commanding the Death Star. Prowse's humiliation reached its zenith during the production and release of Star Wars in 1977. David was convinced that his voice would be used in the film, and he delivered his lines on set with full commitment. He was unaware that the director, George Lucas, had considered his voice too rural and unintelligent for such a pivotal character from the very beginning. In secret, Lucas hired James Earl Jones to re-record all the dialogue. Prowse only found out that he had been erased from the film while sitting in the cinema at the premiere. For the industry insiders, it was another opportunity to sneer. The big bodybuilder was so dim that he hadn't even realized no one intended to listen to him. He became the symbol of muscle without brains, an actor who was needed only as a coat hanger for a costume and whose intellectual contribution was completely discarded. In 1970s Britain, however, David Prowse was known not just as the Mute Vader, but primarily as the Green Cross Code Man, a superhero in a tight outfit who taught children how to cross the road safely. While this was a noble campaign that saved many lives in the eyes of the adult public and the cynical media, it cemented Prowse's image as a nanny for toddlers. The sight of a 6'6" giant in a white and green suit explaining basic safety rules with exaggerated gestures was fodder for comedians and satirists. He was treated like a cartoon character, someone simple enough to entertain children, but too limited to play serious dramatic roles. The press often wrote about him with a patronizing tone, describing him as a gentle giant who does what he is told and asks no unnecessary questions. The situation worsened at the end of the decade during the filming of The Empire Strikes Back. The filmmakers had such a low opinion of Prowse's discretion and intelligence that they deliberately kept him in the dark regarding the biggest plot twist in cinema history. They were convinced that David would accidentally blurt it out to the press because, and in their view, he lacked the capacity to understand the importance of the secret. Therefore, on set, he was told to speak a fake line, and he learned the truth about Luke Skywalker's parentage just like the rest of the world, from the finished film. This was the ultimate confirmation of his status in the industry. He was a useful body who could not be trusted with even a single line of real text for fear that he would ruin everything with his alleged incompetence. David Prowse spent the 1970s as a man in a mask whose true face and voice were systematically mocked or hidden. He was a pop culture icon, but a mute and powerless one. People laughed at his accent, sneered at his role as the Green Cross Code Man, and ignored his acting ambitions. His story is a sad example of classism in the show business of that era. No matter how big and strong you were, if you sounded like a farmer from Bristol, the film elites in London and Hollywood assumed there was nothing but wind whistling through your ears. Prowse became a legend, but he paid the price of being treated as a useful fool whose contribution to the film's success was limited to standing in the right place and keeping his mouth shut. Tommy Cooper, the magician who mastered failure. In the pantheon of British comedians of the 1970s, There was no figure more recognizable and simultaneously more misunderstood than Tommy Cooper. This massive man, standing nearly 6'4" tall with his trademark red fez, built his entire career on being perceived as a complete failure. To the millions of viewers who tuned in to watch his shows, Cooper was the embodiment of chaos and incompetence. His act consisted of ruining every magic trick he attempted. He dropped props, forgot punchlines, tangled his own legs, and stared at the audience with an expression of utter bewilderment as if he himself did not understand what was happening around him. The audiences of the 1970s roared with laughter, but it was laughter directed at someone they considered a lovable oaf, a man who couldn't get anything right in life. The tragedy of Tommy Cooper's image was that the public often could not distinguish brilliant acting from reality. Many people were firmly convinced that Cooper was genuinely stupid or intoxicated on stage. Rumors circulated in pubs and offices that his clumsiness was due to a lack of talent and coordination issues rather than a precisely rehearsed script. He was treated like the village idiot of television, like someone invited onto the stage so people could laugh at his ineptitude. Viewers would often shout at him from the audience, telling him how to do the trick, treating him like a large child who needed help tying his shoelaces. This perception was a financial blessing but an artistic curse, as it completely overshadowed the fact that he was one of the most talented illusionists of his generation. To pretend to be such a bad magician, one has to be a master in reality. But in the 1970s, few people appreciated this nuance. Cooper was a member of the prestigious Magic Circle, and his failed tricks required surgical precision to look like accidental mistakes. However, in the eyes of the general public, he was simply that big bloke who can't do anything properly. The tabloid press often portrayed him as a tragic figure, and suggesting that his stage clumsiness was a reflection of his private life. His famous catchphrase, "just like that," became a national slogan used in situations where someone did something stupid or thoughtless. Cooper became the symbol of joyful ignorance, a mascot for everyone who felt lost in a complicated world. Behind the scenes, Tommy Cooper was a deeply unhappy man, consumed by the fear of rejection. He knew that the audience paid to see him fall and embarrass himself, not for his true skills. This created an enormous internal conflict. He had to constantly wear the mask of the idiot, even when he stepped off the stage. People expected him to spill soup in a restaurant or trip over his own feet in a shop. He was a prisoner of his own creation, forced to play the role of the jester 24 hours a day. His struggles with alcohol, which intensified in the 1970s, were often dismissed by those around him as part of his funny character. Viewers thought his slurred speech was another joke, failing to see the cry for help from a man buckling under the weight of a fame built on pretending to be stupider than he really was. In the 1970s, Tommy Cooper was the king of the comedy of errors, but the price for the crown was the loss of respect as a serious artist. People loved him, but they did not admire him in the traditional sense. Rather, they pitied him, deriving a perverse pleasure from his failures. He was living proof that in that decade, success could be achieved by becoming a laughingstock. His legacy is a paradox. He was a genius who convinced an entire nation that he was an idiot. And he did it so effectively that most people never knew the truth about his brilliant mind. Until the end of his days, he remained trapped in the body of a clumsy giant who could produce a dove from his sleeve, but could not make the world stop laughing at him. Bresslaw, The Gentle Giant's Secret. If there was a man in British cinema of the 1970s whose external appearance was in such stark conflict with his interior self, it was undoubtedly Bresslaw. This towering actor, measuring 6'7", was the pillar of the Carry On franchise. To the millions of Britons who roared with laughter in the cinemas, Bresslaw was the embodiment of the big, lovable lummox. His roles were almost identical in every film. He played characters who were slow, slightly dim, and with a heart of gold, but the mind of a child, tripping over his own feet and failing to understand the double entendres spoken by his sharper colleagues. The public adored him for this image of the harmless giant, but it was a love laced with the patronizing assumption that the actor was just as simple as the characters he created. The reality, however, was completely different and deeply frustrating for Bernard. Privately, he was one of the most educated and intelligent men in British show business. While on screen, he made goofy noises and allowed himself to be outsmarted by shorter men. During breaks between takes, he would sit in his dressing room reading the works of philosophers, studying astronomy, or reciting passages of classical literature from memory. He was a man of extraordinary personal culture and deep thought, dreaming of great Shakespearean roles. Unfortunately, the film industry of the 1970s was ruthless towards people with his physical attributes. Directors and producers looked at his impressive frame and the gawping expression he could summon on command and immediately pigeonholed him as an idiot. The image of the buffoon stuck to him so firmly that it became a second skin he could not shed. The press often described him as the mascot of the Carry On series, someone who is funny simply because he is big and clumsy. Journalists rarely asked him for his opinions on political or artistic matters, assuming in advance that Bernard the Big would have nothing wise to say. He was treated like an oversized child, which was a daily torture for a man with such a brilliant mind. He had to smile for the cameras and pretend that he enjoyed being a laughingstock, while deep down he suffered from wasting his talent on cheap gags about banging his head on door frames. This situation was particularly painful in the context of his theatrical ambitions. Bernard yearned to play tragic roles, psychologically complex characters that would allow him to use his powerful voice and stage charisma. However, every time he appeared at a casting for a serious drama, he saw the same flash of recognition in the director's eyes. To them, he was that bloke from the comedies who pulls silly faces. The audience was not ready to accept the fact that their favorite jester could be an intellectual. In the 1970s, the prevailing belief was that if you looked like a gorilla, you couldn't think like a poet. And Bresslaw was a victim of this prejudice, trapped in the body of a gladiator with the soul of a philosopher. His role in the film Carry On Girls from 1973 is a perfect example of this sad paradox. He played a contestant in a beauty pageant dressed as a woman, which was intended to be the height of comedy. Although he performed the task with professionalism, for many critics it was the moment his dignity was finally sacrificed on the altar of cheap entertainment. People laughed at his hairy legs and clumsy movements, failing to see the tragedy of an actor agreeing to humiliation to support his family. Bernard Bresslaw spent the entire decade of the 1970s hiding his intellect from a world that preferred to see only muscle power. He was a man who knew more about history and art than most of the critics who mocked him. But he had to remain silent and play the role of the amiable fool because that was what the market demanded. His story is a poignant finale to this examination, reminding us that in the world of entertainment, appearances are most deceptive. The audience's loudest laughter often drowns out the quiet weeping of the artist, reduced to a caricature of himself. And Bernard Bresslaw was the smartest idiot British television ever produced. The 1970s were indeed a wild era in British entertainment, but the true story is far more complex than it appeared on the surface. These 10 celebrities were not the dim-witted fools that the public perceived them to be. They were highly skilled performers who committed so fully to their craft that they convinced an entire nation of their incompetence. Tony Blackburn survived the decade as a national punchline, but his resilience and dedication kept him on the airwaves. Sid Vicious became a tragic symbol of exploitation, his lack of musical ability weaponized by those who saw profit in chaos. Paul Henry gave such a convincing performance as Benny that he lost his own identity in the process. Andrew Sachs endured physical punishment and public mockery while delivering one of the most perfectly timed comedic performances in television history. Michael Crawford risked his life performing dangerous stunts, only to be dismissed as a buffoon. Robin Askwith kept British cinema alive financially while being crucified critically. Barbara Windsor hid her sharp intelligence behind a mask of giggles and jiggling, surviving in an industry that refused to see her talent. Or David Prowse was silenced and mocked for an accent that betrayed his working-class origins. Tommy Cooper was a master magician whose greatest trick was convincing everyone he was hopeless. And Bernard Bresslaw was a philosopher in a giant's body, forced to play the fool to earn his living. The lights were most definitely on upstairs for all of these performers. The real question is whether the lights were on for the audiences and critics who couldn't see past the characters to recognize the brilliance beneath. The 1970s didn't produce dim celebrities. It produced a culture that preferred to laugh at perceived stupidity rather than acknowledge the intelligence required to portray it so convincingly. These 10 stars left us wondering not about their own intelligence, but about our collective inability to distinguish performance from reality. They were not playing parts. They were sacrificing their dignity, their health, and sometimes their sanity to give us entertainment. The joke, it turns out, was never on them. It was always on us.